Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling something I know a lot of you have been curious about, and that's whether globalization is actually helping or maybe hurting when it comes to women's political power around the world.
Interesting question.
So to really dig into this, we're going to be looking at some research from Comparative Sociology.
Okay.
And they take this really fascinating look at what's called world society theory and how it plays out.
Right.
And get this, right off the bat, we've got this super intriguing case study, Rwanda.
Oh, yeah, Rwanda. It definitely makes you stop and think because they consistently rank so high when it comes to closing that gap between men and women in terms of political power.
I know, right. It really kind of throws a wrench in our assumptions about, where we typically think progress is being made.
Yeah, and what makes it even more interesting is that Rwanda's success on this front seems to be tied to some pretty intentional policies they put in place. And the article suggests that a lot of this might actually be connected to how involved they are with the global community.
Okay, so that's what we're going to unpack today. But before we get too far into it, I think it's important to define our terms.
Good point.
When we talk about this gap in political power between men and women, what exactly are we talking about?
So basically, it boils down to the difference in men and women's ability to participate in politics, like really make their voices heard and influence decisions.
Gotcha. So it's not just about, holding office, but about having real impact.
Exactly.
And the study looked at this in a couple of different ways.
Okay.
One way they measured this is pretty straightforward, looking at the percentage of women who are actually holding seats in their national parliaments.
Right. Makes sense.
And the other measure they use is a little bit more well-rounded, I guess you could say.
You okay?
It takes into account not just those parliament seats, but also things like the proportion of women who are serving as government ministers, and even the number of years that women have held executive offices.
So it gives you a more complete picture over time.
Right. One gives us a snapshot, and the other is like a bigger picture over time.
Exactly.
And here's the good news. Globally, both of these measures have actually been improving over the past few decades.
That's great to hear.
Using some pretty sophisticated statistical analysis, the researchers found that, get this, between 1997 and 2019, the percentage of women in parliaments jumped up by 11%.
Wow.
And that more comprehensive measure, the one that looks at things over time, that closed by a whopping 39% from 2006 to 2019.
So we are seeing some real measurable progress, which is definitely encouraging.
Definitely. Now, here's where that world society theory we mentioned earlier comes into play.
All right.
This is where we start to dig into the why behind this progress. How much of this positive change can we really attribute to this idea of a shared set of values that are spreading around the world?
So world society theory basically says that there are certain values like human rights, gender equality, things like that, that are becoming more and more important on a global scale.
Yeah.
And the countries that are really plugged into this global network, through things like memberships in the UN, international agreements, all of that, well, they're the ones that are more likely to adopt these values.
It's almost like, I don't know, a kind of global peer pressure.
Yeah. Like everyone's watching and there's this push to get on board with these values, even if their own local cultures might be a little resistant to them.
Makes sense. And to actually test this, the researchers use this thing called the Political Globalization Index.
Okay.
And this basically measures just how deeply a country is embedded in this global network. You know how connected they really are.
Got it.
And you want to hear what they found.
Lay it on me.
The higher a country's score on this index, the less gender inequality they have.
Oh, wow. That's pretty significant.
And that goes for both those measures we talked about earlier, women in parliament and that broader measure of political influence.
So it really does seem like connecting with the global community is having a positive impact in this area.
Yeah. It's some pretty compelling evidence to back up the theory.
It is.
But of course, it's never quite as simple as saying, more globalization automatically equals more equality.
Of course not.
There are other factors at play, right?
Absolutely. And one of the big ones is local culture, and specifically religion. Different religious traditions have very different ideas about gender roles, and that definitely comes into play here.
So how did they work religion into the research?
Well, they looked at the predominant religion in each country, and that's where some really interesting patterns emerged.
Like what?
Well, for example, countries with a majority Protestant population, they actually started out with the highest levels of women in parliament.
Interesting.
But then their progress seems to have kind of leveled off recently, like they hit a ceiling.
A ceiling, wow.
Yeah. Now, on the other hand, countries with a Catholic majority, they actually showed the biggest improvement in that broader measure of political power, the one that looks at things over time.
Uh-huh.
But they started from a lower point, so they had more room to grow.
Gotcha.
And then you have Islamic majority countries, and they had the fastest rate of improvement.
Oh, wow.
But they're still lagging behind those other groups.
So even though there's this global push towards more equality, it's definitely playing out in different ways depending on the local context.
It's not a one-size-fits-all situation, that's for sure.
It's so fascinating to see how globalization and those local cultural beliefs are kind of interacting and bumping up against each other.
It really is. And just wait till you hear what they found about religious diversity.
Okay, so are you ready for this?
Yeah.
The study found that countries that have like a bigger mix of different religions within them,
Okay.
those countries were actually more likely to be influenced by global norms on gender equality.
Really? That's kind of surprising when you think about it.
I know. You'd think that having all those different viewpoints would make it harder to kind of get on board with this global push for equality.
Yeah, you would.
But it turns out the data tells a different story.
Huh.
It's almost like having all that diversity kind of makes societies more adaptable,
I see what you're saying.
more open to change,
Mm-hmm.
because they're already used to dealing with different perspectives.
Mm.
It challenges that idea that everyone needs to be on the same page, culturally speaking, before any real progress can happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. So a little bit of internal cultural friction could actually be a good thing.
Right. But of course, the article also acknowledges that there can be pushback against these global trends.
Uh-huh.
And they actually use the term decoupling to describe what happens.
Oh, decoupling. So that's when a country kind of adopts policies that look great on paper.
Right. All about gender equality.
But then in reality, they don't really put those policies into practice very effectively.
So it's like they're trying to appease the global community, make it look like you're making progress.
Right. Putting on a good show.
But they're not really walking the walk.
Exactly.
And the article suggests that this decoupling thing, it's especially common in places where those traditional views about gender roles are super deeply ingrained.
Yeah.
So it's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place,
Right. Trying to balance that global pressure for change with that local resistance to it.
And what you end up with is laws that look progressive, but women are still facing real obstacles when they try to participate in politics.
It highlights that just having laws in place, it's not enough. You need a real change in attitudes and behaviors for it to really make a difference.
Yeah, it's like, okay, you have the law, but is it actually being enforced? Are people really changing their minds?
Right. It's a deeper issue.
Which is so much harder to address.
Absolutely. And the article also talks about how these global influences can actually spark a backlash from some groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if people feel like their values are being threatened, they're going to push back even harder.
Exactly. And that backlash can look different in different places.
Okay, how so?
Well, in some cases, you might see a rise in religious fundamentalism.
Right. We've seen that in some parts of the world for sure.
Exactly, where certain groups are really pushing back against what they see as, the negative influence of globalization.
And then in other cases, it might be a more subtle kind of backlash, more about reinforcing those traditional gender roles.
Right, maybe through media or education.
So it's not always this big dramatic opposition. It could be about shaping the narrative, influencing how people see the world.
Exactly.
Wow, it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And the researchers actually connect these global trends to our own lives.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Even if we don't live in a place where like a huge cultural clash is happening.
That's right. They argue that these cultural battles are playing out all around us.
Okay, I'm curious. How so?
Well, think about the media we consume, our online interactions, even just everyday conversations.
Yeah, I can see that. Social media is full of debates about gender roles, and those can get pretty heated.
Exactly. It's easy to just dismiss those online arguments as noise, but they actually reflect these larger global tensions that are bubbling under the surface.
So even if we're not like consciously thinking about world society theory or globalization or whatever,
Right.
those forces are still shaping the way we see the world and interact with these issues.
Like an invisible undercurrent.
Wow, that is wild. So where does all this leave us? What do we do with all this information?
Well, the article doesn't claim to have all the answers, and the authors actually stress that the relationship between globalization and gender equality is always changing.
It's dynamic.
Right, so there's no easy fix or simple solution. It's more about understanding how complex this really is and recognizing all the factors that are playing a role.
So instead of trying to come up with all the answers, maybe it's about asking the right questions.
Exactly, and being open to the possibility that the answers might be much more complicated than we initially thought.
And those answers might change over time.
That's a great point. We need to stay curious, keep learning, and be willing to adapt our thinking as the world around us changes.
This has been such a fascinating conversation, and I'm really excited to move on to the last part of our deep dive. Hopefully, we can explore some potential solutions or at least some strategies for navigating this really complex issue. All right, so we're wrapping up our deep dive into this whole issue of global gender inequality in politics, and I don't know about you, but I'm really hoping we can end on a more positive note.
Yeah.
I mean, after all that talk about pushback and all the challenges, are there any signs of hope? Like, are there things that seem to be actually working?
Well, the article does point to some approaches that seem to be making a real difference, and one that's been gaining a lot of traction lately is this idea of transnational feminist networks.
So women from different countries, different backgrounds coming together and working towards a shared goal.
Exactly. These networks can be really powerful because they allow women to connect across borders, share strategies and resources, support each other.
It's like they're creating this global support system, this incredible sisterhood that's working to challenge those deep-seated patriarchal norms, which is so inspiring to see.
It really is, and these networks operate on all different levels. You have grassroots organizations doing work on the ground, and then others are focused on lobbying international organizations, trying to influence policy at a much larger scale.
So it's like applying pressure from both the bottom up and the top down, which is a brilliant strategy.
And it's been pretty effective, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the article mentions that these networks have played a key role in things like the global push for gender quotas in politics.
Right. We talked about quotas earlier, and it seems like those have made a difference in some places.
Definitely, but the research does caution that quotas aren't a magic bullet, you know?
They're not going to solve everything overnight.
Exactly. They need to be implemented carefully and thoughtfully, and they tend to be most effective when they're combined with other strategies.
Like what kinds of strategies?
Well, education, for one. Empowering girls and women through education, that's absolutely essential for long-term change. It's about giving them the tools they need to become leaders, agents of change.
Yeah, because if you educate a girl, you educate a whole generation. Or so the saying goes.
Exactly. And it's not just about basic literacy either.
Right.
It's about things like critical thinking skills, problem solving, building confidence. All the things that are essential for effective political participation.
So it's about equipping them not just with knowledge, but with the skills to navigate this complex world of politics.
Precisely.
So education is key. But what else is important alongside that?
Economic empowerment is another big one.
Right, it makes sense. When women are financially independent, they have more freedom to speak up, to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. Economic independence gives women more choices, more agency, and that translates to more power to make their voices heard.
It's about breaking down all those barriers that prevent women from fully participating in society, both economically and politically.
You're correct.
I'm sensing a theme here, and I like it. It sounds like we're starting to build some real momentum towards a more gender-equal world. I mean, is that a fair assessment based on what the researchers found?
I think there's definitely reason to be optimistic. We've seen some incredible progress, especially in recent decades, and the research suggests that there's no reason to believe that progress is going to stop.
That's good to hear.
But it's important to remember that change often happens in waves.
Waves.
Right. You have those periods of rapid advancement, but they're often followed by times of consolidation, even backlash sometimes.
So we need to be prepared for those setbacks and just keep pushing forward, even when it feels like we're not making much progress.
Exactly. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And it's a marathon we need everyone to run, not just women.
That's such an important point. Getting men and boys involved in this conversation is absolutely essential because ultimately a more gender-equal world benefits everyone, right?
Absolutely.
And it creates a fairer, more just society for all of us.
A rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Exactly. So, as we wrap up our deep dive today, what's the message we want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the big takeaway here is that even though globalization can be this incredible force for good, especially when it comes to gender equality, it's not going to happen on its own.
Right, it's not automatic.
It takes conscious effort, intentional action, people really showing up and doing the work, individuals, communities, institutions, everyone.
It's a team effort.
And it's a reminder that change is possible.
Yes.
We've already made such incredible strides, and that should give us hope, fuel our determination to keep pushing forward.
Absolutely. It's a message of hope, but also a call to action, to keep challenging those outdated norms, keep pushing those boundaries, and to keep working together to build a world where everyone, regardless of gender, has an equal opportunity to participate and shape their future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for having me.
This was such a fantastic conversation. It's been a real pleasure. And as always, we encourage all of you to keep exploring these issues, keep having those critical conversations, and be a part of this incredible movement towards a more just and equitable world for all.
Here.
Until next time, keep diving deep